There is a moment in history so explosive, so charged with raw ambition and political fury, that it almost changed the entire map of the post-war world. And almost no one talks about it today. In the spring of 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed under the weight of Allied pressure from every direction, one man stood at the edge of the greatest opportunity any military commander had seen in a generation. General George S. Patton, the most feared and celebrated battlefield commander in the American arsenal, looked east, past the agreed-upon boundaries, past the diplomatic arrangements made at Yalta, past the cautious orders of his superiors. And he saw something the politicians didn't want to see, that the Soviet Union was not an ally to be embraced, but a threat to be contained, and that the moment to act was now, before the guns fell silent, and the world was carved up by men in suits sitting around conference tables. What he wanted to do in those final weeks of World War II, what he actually said behind closed doors, and what Harry S. Truman ultimately decided. That story is a thunderclap that still echoes through the corridors of modern history. If this kind of buried, world-altering history is what moves you, the kind they don't teach in school, the kind that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew, then subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves real history, and drop a comment below telling us what you already know about Patton. Because what's coming next will change the way you see the end of World War II forever. By March of 1945, the Third Army under Patton's command had become a legend unto itself. Since breaking out of the Normandy beachhead at Avranches in late July of 1944, Patton's forces had swept across France with a speed and ferocity that left German commanders stunned and Allied planners scrambling to keep up. He had crossed the Moselle, relieved the besieged garrison at Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, and by early 1945 was driving deep into Germany with an energy that seemed almost supernatural. On March 22, 1945, he crossed the Rhine River at Oppenheim, a full day before Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's heavily publicized crossing to the north, a fact Patton made sure to report with unconcealed glee to General Omar Bradley. He was not merely winning a war. He was performing for history. But beneath the drama, beneath the ivory-handled revolvers and the lacquered helmet and the sharp theatrics, Patton was thinking something that made his superiors deeply uncomfortable, something that would soon put him on a collision course not just with military protocol, but with the President of the United States himself. What Patton was thinking had its roots in his profound distrust of Soviet intentions. While most American generals, and certainly most American politicians in early 1945, still operated under the assumption that the wartime alliance with Joseph Stalin could translate into a durable post-war partnership, Patton saw things differently. He had watched Soviet behavior in Poland. He had read the intelligence reports. He had spoken with refugees streaming west, terrified not of the defeated Germans, but of the advancing Red Army. In his diary, which he kept with remarkable candor throughout the war, Patton wrote with barely disguised contempt about the Soviet Union, calling Stalin's forces a threat that the Western Allies would one day have to confront. He wrote on May 7, 1945, the very day Germany signed the unconditional surrender at Reims, that the Allied armies should immediately push east and drive the Soviets back to where they belonged. He believed, with the absolute certainty of a man who has studied war his entire life, that the moment of maximum Western military advantage was precisely this moment, when the American and British armies were at full strength, fully supplied, and the Soviet forces were still consolidating. He was not speaking in metaphor. He was speaking as a general who wanted orders to march. By late April and into May of 1945, Patton's Third Army had pushed into Czechoslovakia. On May 4th, with the war in its final hours, his forces captured Pilsen. The question hanging in the air like smoke was how far east he would be permitted to go. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had already made the fateful decision to halt American forces at the Elbe River, allowing Soviet troops to capture Berlin, a decision that was partly military, partly diplomatic, and enormously consequential. Patton had argued against this. He had told Bradley that not only could he take Berlin, but that he could push all the way to the Polish border if given the fuel and the authority. And there it was, the fuel problem that had dogged him since France, the eternal Patton complaint that logistics, not the enemy, was always his greatest obstacle. But now, the obstacle wasn't fuel. It was the political architecture being constructed at that very moment by Roosevelt, and then by Truman, in coordination with Churchill and Stalin. Patton was being asked to stop at lines drawn by diplomats, and for a man of his temperament and vision, it was an almost unbearable constraint. The death of Franklin D. Roosevelt on April 12, 1945, had brought Harry S. Truman, a man virtually unknown to most senior military commanders, into the White House. Truman had not been told about the Manhattan Project. He had not been included in the most sensitive diplomatic discussions. He was, in the words of those around him, a president who had to learn everything at once, in real time, while the world was on fire. And into this atmosphere of transition and uncertainty came Patton, with his sharp tongue and his strategic vision and his absolute refusal to pretend that the Soviet Union was something it was not. Patton met with various commanders and political figures in the weeks after Germany's surrender, and at every opportunity he made his views known with a candor that bordered on insubordination. He spoke openly about the need to rearm German prisoners of war and use them alongside American forces to push the Soviets back. He said this not in private diary entries, but in conversations that spread rapidly through military and diplomatic channels. Word reached Washington, and Truman, still finding his footing, was alarmed. This is the midpoint of a story that deserves to be heard by every person who cares about how the modern world was actually made, not in the clean version taught in textbooks, but in the raw, human, dangerous truth. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now. Like this video, share it with a friend who loves history, and tell us in the comments. Did you know that Patton wanted to go to war with the Soviet Union immediately after World War II? Because most people have never heard this part of the story. The specific incident that brought the crisis to a head came in August of 1945. Patton had been appointed military governor of Bavaria, and in that role he made a series of statements and decisions that lit a fire under the entire Allied command. He was slow, some said deliberately so, in removing former Nazi party members from administrative positions in Bavaria. He argued, with a pragmatism that horrified many, that these men were simply administrators, that Germany needed functioning institutions, and that removing everyone with any party affiliation would collapse civic order. At a press conference on September 22, 1945, he compared the Nazi Party to the Republican and Democratic parties back home, essentially trivializing its murderous ideology. The press erupted. The public was outraged. Eisenhower summoned Patton to Frankfurt on September 28 and dressed him down with a fury that shook even the battle-hardened general. Patton was relieved of command of the Third Army, the army he had built, the army that bore his imprint on every maneuver and every mile it had ever traveled. He was given command of the 15th Army, a paper command with no real troops, designed to write the history of the war. It was, in every meaningful sense, the end. But what did Truman actually say? That is the question that cuts to the heart of this story. Truman, to his credit, did not simply capitulate to popular outrage. He was frustrated with Patton. Yes, deeply frustrated. He found Patton's anti-Soviet statements reckless and his Nazi comparison inexcusable. But he also understood, privately and painfully, that Patton was not entirely wrong about the Soviet threat. Truman was already beginning to shift American foreign policy in the direction that would eventually become the Truman Doctrine of 1947 and the Marshall Plan. He knew the Soviets were not partners in the way Roosevelt had hoped. But he also knew that the American public in the fall of 1945 was desperate for peace, that the boys needed to come home, that the war economy needed to wind down, and that no president could responsibly start a new war against a former ally before the smoke of the last one had even cleared. Truman's response to Patton was not one of a man who disagreed with every instinct the general had. It was the response of a man who understood that even correct instincts expressed at the wrong moment, in the wrong way, by the wrong person, can be catastrophically destructive. Patton never recovered his command. He spent the autumn of 1945 increasingly isolated, increasingly bitter, dictating his memoirs and writing letters, and speaking to visitors with the urgency of a man who felt history slipping away from him in real time. On December 9, 1945, he was involved in a traffic collision near Mannheim, Germany, a low-speed accident that nonetheless left him paralyzed from the neck down due to a severe spinal injury. He died on December 21, 1945, in a military hospital in Heidelberg, Germany, with his wife Beatrice at his bedside. He was 60 years old. Within months of his death, the Iron Curtain descended across Europe exactly as he had predicted it would. The Soviets consolidated control of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The very lands through which Patton's Third Army had raced were swallowed into a sphere of Soviet influence that would not release its grip for more than 4 decades. History did not prove Patton wrong about the threat. It only proved that the moment he saw so clearly was a moment the world was not yet ready to seize. The story of George Patton and Harry Truman in those final months of 1945 is not simply a military story. It is a story about the unbearable tension between what a person knows and what the world will allow them to do about it. It is about the gap between strategic vision and political reality, between the general who sees the next war before it starts and the president who must govern the peace that exists right now. Patton was a man out of time, medieval in his valor, Napoleonic in his ambition, Cassandran in his prophecy. And Truman was a man who had to make real decisions for real people in a world that was exhausted and terrified and hungry for something other than more war. Neither man was entirely right. Neither man was entirely wrong. And between them, in that charged and volatile space, the shape of the Cold War world was quietly, invisibly determined. If this story moved you, if it made you think, made you feel, made you see the past differently, please subscribe to this channel, like this video right now, share it with someone who deserves to hear what history really sounded like, and leave a comment below telling us what surprised you most. Because the stories that change how we see the present are always buried somewhere in the past, and this channel exists to find them.